The CCCR, or Centre for Creative and Cultural Research, investigates the ancient, innovative relationship between social culture and creative production. Based in the Faculty of Arts and Design at the University of Canberra, we generate scholarship and artwork in a wide array of humanities, social science, applied and creative disciplines. You are listening to a fresh presentation from the CCCR's Culture and Creativity Seminar Series. The presentation was delivered with slides. To view those slides, or to learn more about the Centre's work, please follow the links in the program notes. This podcast was recorded on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. Hi everybody, my name's Paul McGee and I'm the Director of the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research. I want to start by acknowledging that we are here on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I'd like to pay my respect to all First Nations people here today and all elders past and present. So today I've got the pleasure of introducing Dr. John Ting, who is an architect, researcher, educator and Melbourneite at the University of Canberra, Australia, where he's the course convener of the Master of Architecture program. John researches Sarawak's architectural and construction history and prefabricated timber buildings in 19th century colonial Southeast Asia and Australia, where he examines the influence of vernacular and migrant labour, migration and colonisation on the production of architecture. Please join me in welcoming John.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, so welcome everyone. This talk is really the journey of my PhD and really the journey of myself as an architect growing up in Malaysia and being trained in Australia. I'm looking at Australian architecture today, and this was something that began as a conversation with Dr. Sally Farah, who's in the audience here, and when we were reviewing Australian architectural historiography, if you like. And I suppose looking at the idea of a national architecture. My journey in architecture does not start in Australia. I was born in Australia, but my parents moved back to Malaysia before I was one, and I came back to high school in Melbourne and then started studying architecture at RMIT. So one of the things that I noticed while I was studying architecture in the 1980s was that there was an idea of architectural purity, type, and also origin. And I was told that it was architecture because you could map it from textbooks. But I couldn't do the same with the architecture of Sarawak, which is where my dad grew up and where I spent most of my childhood. Because there were no textbooks. So what does one do in those cases? And I think it's the same with Australia, right? If we look at the Victorian Parliament on the bottom slide there, we can read that through the standard text. You know, we can see the classical orders, we understand scale, stone, construction, permanence, and so on. But what happens when you come across a building that's of hybrid or quote-unquote impure origins, like the old Kuching courthouse on the top? The question for me as a young architect or young architecture student looking for simple answers, aren't we all, is what I saw in Sarawak architecture. This was also I would say the kind of early post-colonial period. So really there was lots of hangover from the colonial period then and as it is now. There was this separation between modern and developed and also modern and developing, I should say. So that was my kind of ambivalence, I suppose. To actually see what architecture was, as a graduate, I have to admit I took the simple answers, right? I just went with the flow. My curiosity was piqued again when I worked there between 1997 and 2003, where I started to look at this a bit more closely, which led to me starting a PhD at the University of Melbourne to really bring attention to the buildings of Sarawak. And really it was also an inability to reconcile these differences, right? So I was looking for a way to to deal with them, and my supervisor, Anoma Pierres, introduced me to the idea of the post-colonial or post-colonial theory. That really comes from the work of Edward Said, where he was using critical theory that was being explored in Europe or in the West through the work of Foucault and others, and applying it to the context of the Middle East. And from that, then you had people like the Subaltern Studies Group, so Ranjit Guha and Gayatri Spivak and others, who were actually bringing Said's work, adapting Said's work from the context of the Middle East to that of South Asia, which has then again extended and been adapted to Southeast Asia. So really what this is to actually see the divide between the Europe and the Orient as one of control, I guess, one of possession. So the idea of Orientalism was to domesticate the Orient and turn it into a province of European learning, as Anoma Pierres says. So if we take that, if we look at, say, the work of Foucault and that oppositional schema, that was what Said was using. And really what the Subaltern Studies Group started to look at it in a different way, right? So the famous essay by Gayatri Spivak is, "Can the Subaltern speak?" And the answer to that is yes, the Subaltern can speak. And we have to remember that in the context of a colonial place, really everything is about establishing that difference between colonizer and colonized. So when you go to look at the archival material, how do you actually then find the voices of the subaltern? So that's where they engaged, in simple terms, Foucault's idea of reading between the lines, and actually found out a lot about what was happening to the colonized, what the colonized were doing in order to push back against the colonizers. And really, I suppose subaltern comes from the work of Gramsci, an Italian who was talking about subaltern group, which is basically in military terms people who didn't have a voice. So they've applied that. Now this was really in literary theory, I think, and history, not really in architecture. So this idea really didn't get adapted in architecture until the late 90s, in particular with the work of Gulsum Baida Notam Loglu, who was one of the editors of Post-Colonial Spaces, and was also one of the early people who actually looked at the idea of canonical architectural texts, and this is where we start to get into architecture. So she did actually a study on Bannister Fletcher's History of Architecture, which you see on the left there. This was one of the main history texts that I had in architecture school. So this book was first published in 1896, and there was 15 editions before he died. And then the 17th edition of 1961 was the first edition edited after his death. So this project went on, right? And the other book that I looked at when I was a student was Pevsner's An Outline of European Architecture, which you see on the right. So both of these texts, really without saying it, are actually oppositional, have an oppositional or divisive approach. You can't really see it. What you look at when you look at Bannister Fletcher is this amazing drawings and these studies, and he's looking at the idea of style using a survey methodology and classifying everything. You know, like colonials classified everything as well. So what he did do was he looked at, he devised everything into the historical and non-historical styles, which you can see on his tree of architecture on the left. And on the right there, we see an example of Pevsner's classifications or divisions. So we've got Lincoln Cathedral, which Pevsner considered high architecture. And there were other things that he considered just as building and not architecture. So there's this division between high architecture and low architecture. So he says, a bicycle shed is a building, Lincoln Cathedral is a piece of architecture. Nearly everything that encloses space on a scale sufficient for a human being to move in is a building. The term architecture applies only to buildings designed with a view to aesthetic appeal. The building on the bottom is outside of architecture, and of course it is ironic that this is now a heritage listed building that is outside architecture in the UK itself. So you can see this division that Pevsner actually engages. Now with Fletcher, his tree of architecture was also a division, right? So really, he divided it into the historical and non-historical styles. So what we see here is the top of the tree, where you've got things like English, Italian, Spanish, and so on, French, and then you've also got the Byzantine, the Romanesque, the Saracenic, which comes out of the ancients, which is, if you see the top there, the Greek and the Roman. Okay, so these are all the styles that Fletcher considered to be historical, so styles that could develop. Whereas what we see on the bottom there is the styles that could not develop and therefore were non-historical in his nomenclature. Now, I should also point out that there was no examples of modern architecture in Asia and hardly any in Australia in the later editions of this book here. When we look here, we see an example of the historical styles on the left with the Royal Hospital in Greenwich, and then the non-historical style with Chinese architecture on the right. So what we can start to see here is that there's this division, and that's linked to the professionalization of architecture. In terms of Pevsner, whose book was 1943, that kind of division fed into an idea of professional architects and non-architects. Right? The UK Architects Registration Act was 1931. Which was administered by the UK Architects Registration Board. Interestingly, in the colonies, they were much more progressive. So the Architects Registration Board of Victoria was established in 1924, and the Singapore Architects Ordinance established in 1926, which also included Malaya. So this really raises the question of what an architect is. And if we look here, the term architect comes from the Greek word archi and tekton, meaning someone who is the chief builder, in effect. And the reason I show Alberti over here is that Alberti was the Renaissance architect Leon Battista Alberti, who died in 1472, was considered to be one of the first architects when you started to divide architects away from builders, right? So what Alberti did was that he prepared all the documents, he designed the buildings, and then he organized for the construction. So he was still a construction manager, but he didn't actually swing hammers himself. So this was at a time when we were talking about the gentleman amateur. Right? Obviously, he received patronage from his clients, but he was really already independently wealthy and didn't rely on this for his living, if you like. If we go now to look at how we consider architects, there's a few ways that we consider architects habitually. So first of all, the architects as an artist, right? Like Le Corbusier on the left and Monet on the right. This is a little lacking because architects also need to deal with space and with function, and it's not just something that one person does. It's actually something that is created by quite a few people. Architectural history always refers to these individuals. Then we get the architect as designer. This is much more what you imagine in architecture school, someone producing drawings and working with design, but it is still seen as a very solitary sort of thing. The individual creates, I guess, even though the production of architecture requires quite a few more people. The third one is the architecture as builder. So we're going back to a more old-fashioned idea of someone who actually makes things, yeah? So not just the artist and the designer, but someone who's actually making things. And here we have Brunel and your anonymous, let's say, subaltern worker on the Empire State Building. So there's some truth in this, but again, this is lacking, right? This is a shortcut that is letting us down. And finally, of course, all of the above, the architect as the individual genius or God. Now, again, this is somewhat correct, but sort of belies the fact that it is such a collaborative thing that is produced by a whole group of people in terms of architecture, right? But I think architectural education, especially the teaching of architectural history, uses these shortcuts in maybe a little bit of a dangerous way, because it denies the voice of all the other people who are involved in it. Certainly we still refer to these individual geniuses by name, so Rem, Zaha, and so on and so forth, even though the offices that Rem leads and Zaha used to lead before her passing had hundreds and hundreds of people in them. Yeah, and that was just in the architecture office, not to mention the consultants, or the builders, or the client bodies, and so on and so forth. If we then go to the other books that I looked at when I was in architecture school, we were looking then at, we were using Frampton's Modern Architecture on the left and Tafuri and Delco's Modern Architecture on the right. So Frampton's book first came out in 1990, and Tafuri and Delco first came out in Italian in 1976. So these books were then looking at things in terms of a period, right? So they're skiving off the modern period, which goes back to the early 19th century. Some would say it goes back to the Renaissance, in terms of the study of architecture. And so they were dividing the modern from the pre-modern period, but still it was incredibly sort of Eurocentric, yeah? And methodologically, they weren't really classifying all these things. They were actually using a Marxian methodology to look at architecture, which means that they were looking at power and so on. But still, there was this obsession with the individual, right? So architecture so this was something that actually helped us to look at modern buildings more widely, but still it was kind of limited. If we then look at Australian architecture, and so in architecture schools, what you tend to do is to look at the big survey courses which take you through the ancient through to the modern period, and then you specifically look at the modern period in your second year, pretty much from the Industrial Revolution up to the contemporary. And then once you've got all those big ideas, then you start to look at Australian architecture, right? That's how we do it here at UC, and it's quite a common schema. So then that actually raises the question of Australian architecture. We finally get to it. So what are the books on Australian architecture, and how do they actually approach this idea? And I must say that whenever anyone says Australian architecture, I'm thinking about all Australian architecture, so Australian architectural history. But of course, the first one of that name, which is Robert Haddon's 1908 book, Australian Architecture, was actually not a history of Australian architecture, but it was a treatise on what architecture in Australia should be, according to Robert Haddon. He couched it as a technical book, which was the second half of 600 some pages. And the first 300 pages is really what things should look like in different parts of Australia. So you can see on the images on the right, country villa in a temperate climate, and a brick villa in a hot climate. So this is really different designs for different situations. And he doesn't actually say it, but these are actually all his own designs, right? So this was really a big push, a big catalog for him to sell his wares, right? And it was all about him. In terms of Australian architectural history, the first book to actually talk about Australian architectural history as a theme is Architecture in Australia by John Maxwell Freeland of 1968 on the left. The paperback on the right looks much more prosaic with an old house on it, whereas the original hardcover is much more modern. So Freeland looks at Australian architecture since white settlement, and doesn't consider any of the architecture that existed before white settlements. But he was quite comprehensive, because he goes through the early years in terms of vernacular architecture. He looks at prefabricated houses coming in to make up for the lack of houses in the country, but he's privileging steel prefabricated houses rather than the timber ones that we have. Although we did have them, like for example here we have a Manning house that was imported by Governor Latrobe into Melbourne and erected there in I think around 1840. So these kinds of prefabricated timber houses existed alongside the steel ones, and they were all manufactured in the UK. Okay, so you really see that there's this reliance on the metropolis to feed the colonies. The second wave of prefabricated buildings is a bit more interesting. So what I'm showing you here is a World Heritage listing proposal put out by a group in Melbourne led by Miles Lewis. And what I've highlighted there in yellow over there is the Singapore cottages, which I came across during my PhD. You can see Latrobe's cottage up there in red. And really the interesting thing about the Singapore cottage is that it was manufactured in Singapore by colonial companies using colonized labor to create sort of early prefabricated houses, flat packed and shipped to Melbourne and to other places in Victoria, as well as New South Wales, basically 19th century IKEA for houses. This is a very interesting thing, right? And it's really about mobility. And really what we see is Australian architectural historiography privileges traditional ideas about architecture, which is fixed, made out of stone, permanent, and so on and so forth, right? So Australian Colonial Architecture by Philip Cox and Clive Lucas is an interesting book because it really starts off very interestingly by actually looking at the interaction between Aboriginal people and European people when the First Fleet settled in Sydney Cove, and it does that in the first of 3 chapters. Now, in the second chapter, it talks about high-style colonial architecture, where it's basically abandoning an idea of the vernacular and coming to an idea that architecture is then only produced by architects, right? So high architecture versus low again. And in the third chapter, it talks about the colonial revival. So despite my hope that I would learn a bit more about everything that was happening during the colonial period, including what happened to vernacular Aboriginal architecture, this was not to be, because it turned into, again, a kind of chorus of how good architects were and why we should have them. Slightly understandable because of the way that Philip Cox and Clive Lucas were trained, both also practicing architects. So there's one mention that Governor Phillip brought a prefab house with him on the First Fleet, but that's the end of it. Okay, so you're starting to see that architecture is something that is very much about a conventional sense of place. It needs to be linked to a place. It needs to be designed into a certain way which is tied back to the metropolis. It needs to be made out of long-lasting materials and so on and so forth. So it goes back to that colonial idea that you have to divide yourself or separate yourself from the colonized, right? To actually bring yourself closer to the colonizers. Really, you can see that I was looking for these Singapore cottages in all the history books and was not having much luck finding them. The next 2 books that cover Australian architecture are Donald Leslie Johnson's Australian Architecture 1901 to 1951, and also Jennifer Taylor's Australian Architecture since 1960, and the book came out in 1986. So not quite sure how I'm supposed to consider those 9 years between 1951 and 1960. Maybe that's when all the discussion about vernacular architecture was. These 2 books are very much about the production of architects, right, of formally trained architects, which is interesting because it then is the link between the training of architects actually adopting metropolitan models, so British models in Australia, to actually make architecture, right? And all of it is about, firstly, how it's linked back to it through style, through technology, through approach, and secondly, how it's adapted to the context of Australia. Now, what is interesting is that the architect then becomes very clearly split into pedigreed architects and non-pedigreed architects through this book, which is actually an exhibition catalogue called Architecture Without Architects by Bernard Rudowski, where he actually looks at vernacular architecture across the world as an exhibition at the MoMA, I believe, in the late 60s. And this was an interesting thing because it was actually saying that the architecture produced by non-architects was still architecture. But then at the back of it, let's not forget that this was still divisive because it doesn't recognize the producers of vernacular architecture as being architects, even though they were doing much of the same thing. There's still that division between vernacular architecture and modern architecture. Which brings us back to this, the Singapore cottage in Collingwood. And really what we start to see when we look at these things through post-colonial theory is that it blurs those definitions between the metropolis and the colony because of its mixed origins. Right. So what we see in these things really is that we see on the top there that we've got influences from Malay carpentry. We see with the scarf joints that there's influences from the Chinese and also the Chinese characters and the ends of beams where they connect. And then also the cross-top plates, which we see here, which are also considered to be Chinese. This is common in all of these Melbourne-based Singapore cottages. Here again, you can see that the intermediate roof beam on the bottom left, and then the cross-top plates on the bottom right. And then again here with the one that's just been erected at the other end of the site, we see the lightning scarf joint on the bottom left and the intermediate roof beam on the bottom right, and then the cross-top plates also there. On the bottom right is them being assembled, so you assemble the bottom plates and the top plates, and you just match up the Chinese, the vernacular Chinese characters that you see on the bottom left over there. There was some exploration into the origins of this with heritage architect Alan Willingham going to Singapore, getting himself in the papers to actually look for people who knew about the origins of these carpentry traditions, but he couldn't actually find anything. What I was later to discover was that he was just looking in the wrong place because he was looking at conventional architectural sources rather than broadening it to look at other documents. So my own PhD looked at these buildings in Sarawak, which were these timber forts that were built, and there's an interesting story there which we won't go into today. But really, they followed many of the tenets of prefabrication and standardization in design. They were actually made in the capital and then shipped out to a newly conquered area before they were erected there. My PhD case study was this one, Fort Alice in Simangang. I was also involved in the conservation of the building. But when we look at that building, what we can start to see is a lot of the same details you can see in the Singapore cottage over there with the intermediate roof beams, and actually how they were used, which is something that we didn't know from the Singapore cottages in Melbourne because they were so small. They didn't need collar ties, but they put in these intermediate roof beams to support the collar ties in these bigger structures. We can see the cross-top plates and the scarf joints that are used in the building as well. We can not only see them in the forts themselves, so they weren't actually a special thing that were designed for the forts, but you can see it in timber shop houses in Simangang, and actually timber shop houses all throughout Borneo, right? And this is an interesting thing here because these timber buildings, let me go back to the fort. This fort was originally built in 1849 So what you have is this building still surviving today after restoration, when a lot of buildings that were built out of stone and brick have been demolished and rebuilt, especially in Singapore and also in places like Kuala Lumpur. So that idea of permanence is then kind of questioned, right? Does stone and brick really mean something that's more permanent? Or is permanence actually to do more with global economics? The other thing that's interesting is that this form of carpentry was also used to rebuild indigenous longhouses. Then when the Iban groups moved from growing rice and headhunting to actually planting cash crops such as rubber, which meant that they made bucket loads of money in the 1930s. So there again you see that the colonized are very much engaging themselves in colonial networks and actually making lots of money from it, and denying that divide, that colonial and colonizer divide. This tradition persisted right up into the 1960s. So this is a builder's home in Kuching, the capital of Sarawak, where we can see again the same kinds of detailing. You can see it also in the this one is the Istana or the palace in Pontianak, and also then in the big mosque in Pontianak. And then amazingly, let's cycle back to the Straits settlements. So here we're looking at two houses, one in Penang on the left and one in Singapore on the right. And of course, these things never happen by when you actually go and look for it, because I had established this link between Australia and Sarawak, and perhaps that suggested a regional relationship, but I couldn't find anything in Singapore. So as luck would have it, a Singapore academic who was looking at a house, a black and white house, a colonial house in Singapore being conserved, took a picture, posted it on Facebook, and I recognized the cross-top plate in his photograph, and that basically then led to a whole other line of inquiry, which basically showed that this was pervasive all throughout the Malay Peninsula as well as Singapore. When we then look at Australian architecture with knowledge of this, we still see that these kinds of divisions are actually in place. So if we look at the Encyclopedia of Australian Architecture, edited by Philip Gold and Julie Willis, we see actually, I mean, it's a difficult medium, right, the encyclopedia, because it's only about short entries where you can't really get any depth into it. And someone like Miles Lewis, who I mentioned before, is very good at, has got a lot of entries in here. And Miles, on the one hand, seems very egalitarian because he has an interest in construction and interest in architecture. And if you have a look at his website, mileslewis.net, it is really remarkable, a remarkable repository of all things architecture and construction. But on the same note, Miles also still has a hierarchy, right? Miles's hierarchy is that the works that are Bannister Fletcher's historical styles are at the top of the architectural tree, even though he considers everything else as being branches of that. And of course, on the same note, we also have the recent book by Harry Margalit of 2019, which is the Australia edition of Modern Architectures in History. And this just goes to show the difficulty of writing such a book in the first place. So this really questions whether we should even be looking at something like this, right? Because it is an incredibly difficult thing. He covers New South Wales and in particularly Sydney very well, but really you can then say we've gone from being Eurocentric to being Sydney-centric. Yeah, so this hegemony then repeats itself in different ways and doesn't actually open anything up for the colonized or the previously colonized, maybe the currently colonized as well, so to speak. But on the same note, there's been an increased interest in First Nations matters in Australia. So we have this fantastic book by Paul Memmott called Gunya, Gundi and Worley, or Gunya, Gundi and Worley, I think, which is the Aboriginal architecture of Australia. And it just demonstrates how difficult doing something for a nation is, because Mehmet's book really focuses on his particular sphere of influence, which is Northern Australia, and really there's not a lot on Southeast Australia, for example. But having said that, this is the second edition of the book, and it's hugely popular and widely read. So it's a good thing that we're starting to bridge that gap between colonizer and colonized. And what is really interesting about Mehmet's book is that he's actually looking at how Aboriginal architecture has modernized itself throughout the colonial period, just as colonial architecture has slowly been modernizing itself. And really considering things that are produced not by architects, by indigenous groups as being architecture in their own right, and actually responding to a lot of very specific cultural, functional, environmental factors. So not something that's really quite random and rubbish as an idea that would be promoted during the colonial period. But I think, and I think this is a really good thing that we are considering indigenous architecture in this way, and it is finding its place together with modern architecture. So really the question now is, where is everything else, right? Where are the Singapore cottages in this schema over here? So really, what I'm saying here, I guess, is that this is still a divided schema. It is still vernacular architecture on one side and modern architecture on the other side. The Singapore cottage is an interesting thing because it was produced with the modern systems, right? Prefabrication, flat packing, pan-colonial communications, shipping, global economy, etc., etc. But on the other hand, it was actually made by the colonized, which is these Malay and Chinese carpenters. So while we can see that Malay carpentry traditions indicate that the intermediate roof beam is used in lots of Malay houses, when we go to China, we actually see that we actually can't see any cross-top plates and scarf joints because their whole fundamental construction system is different. So really, we're starting to see a very complicated picture there, and that complicated picture is really, in many ways, a picture of Australia, something that bridges between the colonial, the colonized, bridges between a first-level colony like Australia and a second-level colony like Malaya and Singapore, and actually talks more about contact and exchange and how everything is complicated and mixed together, rather than the simple binary of colonizer and colonized. So I might leave it there and maybe we could have some questions. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, John. That was really comprehensive.
It's a naive question, John. Naive in terms of, I don't know, any of the architecture is a word I like. And I'm going back to your start about the subaltern can't speak. Yes, the subaltern can speak. But of course, if no one's listening, because the subaltern doesn't have a platform, then it may as well not be able to speak. So the difficulty in locating your cottages, Singapore cottages, suggests that they, however alive and present they are, they're also kind of silenced.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for that, Jen. I think, and thanks for the reminder. Maybe I should thank you, Dorothy. But I think what I missed out a very major part of this is really that at the end of this, the building actually speaks to us of so the subaltern could not speak and did not speak, but what they made then speaks to us. So we can then see their voice through these built artifacts, through the details and the timbers and so on and so forth. Is that what you meant, or does that help?
It does.
Very good, thank you.
It does take somebody else who's not a subaltern to come along and put a microphone there.
Indeed, and this is the trouble, right? You know, it is always we always have to make the distinction that we are not speaking for them because we are not them, but more that we are trying to figure out what they were saying through these artifacts. So I think this is certainly something that we must do when we're looking at the architecture, for example, of indigenous groups, be them in Malaysia or in Australia, that we are not speaking for them, but we are looking for their voices in the historical record or in the built artifacts.
Sally.
Thank you, John. We've talked about, doing a sort of survey over all these books and writing together, which is hopefully forthcoming when we can find the time. It's a really broad question. It's a big one because I understand this binary opposition or catalogue of styles or positing origin and progress. These are all really problematic in terms of architectural historiography. So integrating First Nations knowledge into a curriculum is wonderful. But how can you essentially decolonise pedagogy or teaching or any sort of Australian history? And that probably pertains to other disciplines as well, right? Like, do you have any sort of pointers or suggestions off the top of your head? I know it's a huge question, but...
I think, thank you, Sally. I think it is a big question. I think what we can say is that given architectural pedagogy, architectural pedagogies and Australian architectural historiography's persistence with upholding these categories and classifications, I think we can safely say that architectural pedagogy in the West and in Australia, and also architectural historiography in the West and in Australia has not decolonized. Yeah, so that is now. What do we do about it? This is I have no idea. I really don't know. This is, of course, you're trying to undo something that is 500 years old, right? Since modern colonization. So I think for a start, what would be good would be the recognition that this is a problem. And the interesting thing is when I started my teaching career here, what I did was I talked about this approach through architectural practice, right? So it wasn't through the glamorous topic or discipline of design, nor was it through the knowledge field of architectural history, but through architectural practice, right? So I think also in architectural pedagogy, there's a hierarchy of what is sexy and glamorous and what is just something we need to do for accreditation. But I think that this methodology, the Subaltern studies approach is really useful because it actually brings to the front what is actually involved in the production of architecture, and of course, all of us who teach architecture, we have to break it down into these silos, right? Because it's too complicated a thing to teach as a whole. So we must teach design as design, history as history, technology as technology, and practice as practice. And of course, contextualizing all of those across each other as a way of actually making it relevant. But I think that's a big challenge, right? I certainly don't know how we can do it because, of course, we come from a society where everybody is looking for simple answers. I mean, I'm sure all of us here have had our students ask us why it has to be so complicated. Why can't you just give me a straight answer? So I think the fact of the matter is that we live in an incredibly complex society. And I think that many of us have our heads buried in the sand because we think that it can actually be something that's simple. Yeah, so I think actually familiarizing our students with the idea of complexity is something that is, and being accepting of complexity, using it as something to generate other things is a really strong position. but of course we still have to be able to talk our students into that and not just give them the simple answers, which we shouldn't be doing anyway, right? They should work it out themselves. Thanks.
No, totally. I mean, I guess what sort of elaborating, it's not just about content, but it is also about methodology and reflecting on that. Like I'm even thinking, you know, you get students to write an essay. What do you say? Compare and contrast. You're immediately setting up like a binary where you're not talking about exchange, translation, potentially interesting things in the subaltern. Anyway. Thank you.
Indeed, and I think it is something that we need to fight against, right? We hear the right sounds all the time, but every now and again, the people who should know better let out something that is that they shouldn't be. For example, the Prime Minister yesterday, but also the Labour Prime Minister yesterday, and just to be fair to Labour. Also the Liberal member for Ginninderra, who, when I met him when he was a public servant, asked me where I was from and could not accept the fact that I was from Melbourne, which I was very disappointed about. He's the guy with the hat, by the way.
Right. John, did you ever encounter, back in the late 80s or early 90s in Melbourne, a young architect called Paul Ha?
No, I did not. But I did meet him at the launch of the book that I was an editor in recently, when Paul Memmott was there as well. So he came along, and yes, had a very short chat to him. But he seemed like a very interesting guy, and especially his work with the Aboriginal communities.
Yeah, I remember having a conversation with him back then, about the time that Jacinda went up to Beagle Bay. Anyway, he was doing some fascinating work with communities where he would go and I know Greg Burgess did this later on, where he would go and he would stay there for some time and he would sit in conversation with people, and they would co-design this structure that then they would actually build together with local materials, and the ripple effect into those communities was extraordinary in terms of, you know, the social, cultural things that were going on. And, you know, from an economic point of view, the buildings that they built were about a tenth of the price of the ones that were being designed in Brisbane, prefabbed in Brisbane, shipped out to some remote regional community, and then not be very appropriate for that climate, yes, or for those people's needs.
Yes.
And it just seemed such a simple solution.
Yes.
You know.
Yes.
And we were getting it so wrong, and then people in government and other people who criticised what was happening to these fabulous things that the government was shipping out there and being altered,
Yep.
being such a disaster. It just seemed such a perfect solution.
Well, that is still happening. So which is still happening, you say? Well, what is still happening is that approach has been adopted by other architects such as Troppo, and really right now what's happening is, because they've got a bit of a profile, what Troppo are doing, because they have all the same problems still. So what Troppo are doing is that they're actually circumventing the process. So what we now have is we have homelands. Yeah, we have Aboriginal homelands in the Northern Territory, which we didn't have in the late 80s. And the idea of the homelands basically is that they are controlled by the homelanders, if you like. And so what Troppo have done to circumvent this problem, to essentially stop this kind of corruption, if you will, of funds not getting to the people that they're supposed to get to, is to talk directly to the elders of the homelands and figure out ways to actually procure housing and other buildings for them without the involvement or with a different kind of involvement from the government. right, where the funding actually goes to the homelands itself, and then the homelands then procure their own buildings. Yeah, so I think there are people out there who are doing interesting things, and things are definitely getting better than from the 80s. But yes, this is it's a long battle against regulation, or against being regulated, I guess. And we all know we are the most over-regulated country in the world, in Australia. And of course, living in Canberra, we also understand that we are the most over-regulated jurisdiction in the most over-regulated country in the world. But I digress. Thank you, Julia.
John, we've got a comment online.
Thank you, Kate. And it was great to learn more about the influences of longhouses. Yes, we must talk more about that, Kate, because they are an amazing typology to be exploring tradition and modernity. Thank you for your kind words, Kate. So, Irfan.
Hi, John. Thank you for that. That was great. Look, this is probably following on from Jen's naive question. As those of us who have studied literature and etc., the post-colonial studies and the subaltern studies group make perfect sense. So this is a field that I'm not, obviously. So when did the subaltern start screaming at you? What was the moment? And is this a large field of study, the subaltern studies group, overlaid on architectural sort of history and studies? And when did you come to it? Were you just out of? You said you in grad school you were just following the usual pattern, and then most of us, we all, I don't want to swear here, but we all come out of Edward Said's, as my friend used to say, left nut. But he yeah, sorry. But he, so when did that moment come for you, and also in general, a bit more about the field, really?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because these ideas transfer from place to place, and then they change as they go along. So I picked it up with the South Asian example. So of basically questioning these power structures, or looking for resistance, looking for biopower, and really my thing was with Sarawak anyway, was to actually say that the subaltern are already speaking in the historical record, because basically the way that Sarawak was run, the engagement between Europeans and vernacular and indigenous groups was very different to what was happening in Malaya and Singapore, which in turn were very different to what was happening in South Asia. Very much in South Asia, you had quite a dialectic kind of situation, although one side of that dialectic was actually made up of a multitude of different groups. But in Southeast Asia, you have the complication of large migrant groups there as well, right? So apart from the Europeans and the indigenous peoples, you have the migrant Chinese and the migrant Indians that were working there, that were brought in by the British. But still, despite the different mix, you still had this relationship between colonized and colonizer, and really the British could call on their gunboats to come in from India and bomb the crap out of people. But in Sarawak, you had a different situation, because the Europeans who were ruling there were ruling as indigenous kings, yeah. So which is complicated, and the thing is that the British had too many colonies already, so they weren't interested in taking on Sarawak as a colony. So you have this strange situation where, for this Englishman to rule, he actually needed the collaboration of the indigenous groups. Indigenous groups are all, in fact, very mixed themselves. So, of course, in the modern period, the Ketuanan Melayu movement in Malaysia, where basically it's the lordship of the Malays over all other people, it's an interesting thing, because Malays have not been calcified as a racial group until the colonials got there. And in the national period, in the independence period, they've adopted that same calcification and not actually seen the hybrid origins of being Malay. So in the context of Sarawak, most Malays there were actually Ibans who converted to Islam. Yeah, so really there's this huge kind of hybrid thing that's happening across Malaysia as a country, and I think also here we have the same hybridity, right? So I think it's all mixed up, and it's a very interesting situation. More recently, again, of course, because of oppositional politics, James Brooke, the first Raja of Sarawak, has been referred to as the White Raja because of course, Rajas can't be white, right? They have to be brown people. Even though there's histories of sultans and rajas, a lot of intermarrying between the Chinese and the Malays and the Indians and the Chinese, blah 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 blah. So the classification itself is fluid and hybrid, right? So what we're seeing now is a hardening of these things again with Trumpian politics. So I think it's, and I've probably gone completely off the point, but I think it's important to remind ourselves of this hybridity and that purity in race and in architecture is an impossible thing.
That is a good note to end on.
Thanks, everyone.